Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome to what I believe will be the final episode of the Mini Muscle Masterclass series. I hope you're finding it valuable so far. In this episode, we're going to cover rep ranges, rest intervals, time-efficient techniques, and finally, we're going to bring all 4 episodes together, where at the end, I will give you a practical example of how to apply everything that I have described in these last 4 episodes. So let's start with rep ranges. First off, I covered this topic in great depth with PhD candidate Daniel Plotkin in episode 75. So if you want to do a deep dive, go listen to that episode. In this podcast, I am going to give you the cliff notes, basically what you need to know about rep ranges in order to design your own hypertrophy program. Based on the research I'm aware of at this moment in time, as long as you are training close enough to failure, hypertrophy seems to be roughly equivalent when performing anywhere between 4 to 5 and 20 to 30 reps. But some exercises may be better suited to specific rep ranges because each rep range requires you to use a different load with a smaller number of reps requiring a greater load to be used than a greater number of reps, assuming you're hitting the same RPE target or the same proximity to failure. My first suggestion would be to always program a target repetition range as opposed to a single repetition number. For example, 8 to 12 repetitions instead of just 8 or just 12. In addition to that, there are some additional considerations to be made regarding the specific type of lift. For instance, if you're doing a compound lift, that's going to be typically more technical and more demanding physiologically than an isolation lift, and you're also spreading the load across multiple joints. So these lifts are typically suited to the 5 to 10 repetition range, whereas if you're training a single joint at a time, it may be better to go for a lighter load and more repetitions in the range of 12 plus repetitions. Because when you're not spreading the weight across multiple joints, using an excessive amount of weight could create more strain on that individual joint than you may want. Furthermore, some machines may require you to adopt a larger rep range than when you're using, for example, dumbbells or a barbell because of the larger weight increments available. For instance, my lat pull-down machine jumps up by 7 kilograms or roughly 15 pounds. And for this reason, while on a row with dumbbells, I might keep the repetition range narrower to 8 to 12, for example. On this lat pull-down machine, I'm keeping it wider. I'm programming 10 to 20 repetitions because there's no way I'm going to hit 12 reps and then go up by 7 kilograms and stay in the 8 to 12 repetition range. Last but not least, as it pertains to the scientific literature that I'm aware of, it seems to be unknown as of yet whether it's more beneficial to stick to the same repetition range all the time for every exercise, or if it would be better to adopt different rep ranges across different exercises for the sake of hypertrophy. But because of the above-mentioned lift-specific constraints that may require you to change the repetition ranges, it makes sense to adopt slightly different ranges depending on the exercise. I am personally of the opinion that different repetition ranges will benefit hypertrophy in the target muscle slightly differently, because when you're hitting a different number of reps, you are also using a different load, either lighter or heavier. And your body doesn't really know what exercise you're doing, it only perceives a change in mechanical tension. And mechanical tension comes from, in part, the load that you're utilizing. Therefore, a different load will create a slight difference in tension, which, in my view, would potentially generate a slightly different stimulus for hypertrophy. And this assumes that different stimuli for hypertrophy are more beneficial than the same stimulus all the time. That's my own personal bias. And as I've said, at this moment in time, I don't know of any evidence that proves me right or wrong, so this is simply my speculation. Now let's move on to rest intervals. My advice is to rest as long as you need or as long as you have time for, so that ideally in your next set, the target muscle is going to be the limiting factor. This is my personal rule of thumb that I tend to recommend to my clients. You'll typically need more rest after a set of a compound lift versus after a set of an isolation lift. So I normally program around 2 to 3 minutes or more after a set of squats, for instance, and 60 to 90 seconds after a set of bicep curls. Based on the research that I'm familiar with, the rest interval may negatively impact performance when you're lasting less than 60 seconds. Now, there is a way to rest less than 60 seconds and offset that decrease in performance, which is if you do more sets, then you may be able to achieve an equal amount of stimulus while doing less than 60-second rest intervals as if you were doing fewer sets with longer rests. But most people would try to shorten the rest periods in order to make the workout more time efficient. Now, if you're also doing more sets, I don't know how much more time efficient that truly is. At that point, the only way to make it truly time efficient would be to accept to do the same number of sets, shorter rest intervals, and accept that hypertrophy will be somewhat limited because of it. That's all for rest intervals because we don't have a ton of research on it, and my view is as long as the limiting factor is the target muscle as opposed to your cardiovascular system because you're out of breath, then you're good and you're resting just as long as you need to. When I'm trying to decide if I'm ready to go for another set, I typically consider these factors. Is my heart rate almost back to normal? It might not be fully back to normal because a workout is supposed to be tiring, but do I feel like it's almost back there? My second consideration is, am I still huffing and puffing? In which case, I'd rest a little bit longer. Third consideration is, would I be able to do at least 5 reps with the same load or a slightly lighter load if you've decided that you want to go lighter in the following set? And these 3 questions help me decide if I've rested long enough. In addition to the already mentioned question, do I think that in the next set my target muscle will be the limiting factor? Once all of the answers to these questions are in a place where I believe that my rest interval has been effective, then I go for another set. The final part of this podcast, before we delve into the practical example, is about time-efficient techniques. Again, this is another topic that I have already covered in a lot of depth, and this was with Dr. Eric Helms in episode 100. So, again, in this particular episode, I'm going to give you the cliff notes. When I'm talking about time-efficient techniques, I'm referring to techniques that typically pack a lot of volume, so a lot of repetitions, into a short period of time. And some of these are drop sets, supersets, myo reps, rest pause sets, and blood flow restriction or BFR. Now, while these techniques are time efficient, the question is, are they time efficient at the expense of hypertrophy? Are we sacrificing stimulus like when we're resting less than 60 seconds, as I touched on earlier? Or are they in some way similar to standard sets where you would complete one set and then rest for a little bit and then go again when it comes down to the hypertrophic stimulus? We don't have research on all of these techniques compared to standard sets, but we have some studies on some of these techniques, which Dr. Eric Helms and I discussed. For example, it seems like 4 drop sets are roughly equivalent to 3 standard sets for hypertrophy. In addition to that, there seems to be no significant difference between doing antagonist supersets and doing standard sets. If anything, in the case of the upper body specifically, antagonist supersets have been found in at least one study that I can think of off the top of my head. They have been found to lead to slightly more volume performed. And in this particular study, what they compared was a superset whereby the participants were doing bench press immediately followed by a bent over row to a situation whereby they were completing these 2 exercises in standard separate sets, not in a superset. And for clarity, a superset is a programming technique whereby you're performing one set of an exercise followed by a set of a different exercise. And when I'm referring to antagonist supersets, then the 2 exercises will be targeting different and antagonist muscles, such as the back and the chest. So muscles that perform opposing but complementary or antagonist actions. So that would be chest and back, or for the lower body, hamstrings and quads. Now, some considerations that I would make when programming time efficient techniques are the following. These techniques are more fatiguing than standard sets, so I tend to place them towards the end of a session, typically in the final sessions of a training week, but not always. And or I might place one time efficient technique as the final set after a few standard sets of the same exercise. These techniques can be specifically cardiometabolically taxing, meaning that the limiting factor could be your cardiorespiratory system more so than the target muscle, especially when you're just starting out performing these. So my advice here would be, if you're doing supersets, simply rest longer. You don't need to start doing the row immediately after you're done with the bench press. You can take a little bit of extra rest. Sure, this makes the superset slightly less time efficient, but if you think about the fact that after a set of bench press, you would rest maybe 2 to 3 minutes before doing another one. After a set of bench press, if your next exercise was a row, you might be resting 60 to 90 seconds max. So you're still cutting down on the time and you're giving yourself more time to make sure that on the row, the back is your limiting factor. As it pertains to other time efficient techniques, my suggestion would be, if you find yourself huffing and puffing and you find that your cardiovascular system is struggling, don't use too many of these techniques within the same session. Start with one and then maybe increase over time when you get more used to them. And give yourself time to become fitter for these techniques by simply doing them over and over again. If you repeat the same exercise that taxes your cardiovascular system over time, you are going to get fitter and find it easier until eventually your cardiovascular system may well no longer be your limiting factor. So that covers the 3 main topics regarding program design that I wanted to discuss in this episode, which means that I'm going to wrap up this Muscle Masterclass series with a practical example where we're bringing everything together. I'm going to circle back to the practical example that I discussed at the end of episode 3. So we have the same imaginary clients with the same imaginary goal of prioritizing the upper body and especially the chest for their upcoming top surgery. But they also want to grow all of their major muscle groups to develop an even physique. They can train 3 times per week, and we settle on the following split: upper, lower, and full body. Now, in the last episode, I gave you an example of an upper body session, the first in the week. I gave you the number of sets and I gave you the exercise selection that I would choose for this particular imaginary client. Now, this time, we're going to bring back those exercises and those sets, but I'm also going to include a number of reps, an RPE target, and also a suggestion for a rest interval. So, in this upper session, which is the first one in the week, we're going to start with a pec deck fly to pre-fatigue the pecs. We're going to do 3 sets of 12 to 20 reps because this is a machine and the weight increments could be pretty substantial. And we're going to assign to this exercise around 60 to 90 seconds rest because it's an isolation exercise and we're doing it for a relatively high number of reps. So I don't expect that we're going to need 2 to 3 minutes plus. And with regard to our intensity of effort, we're going to take this one to failure on every single set because it's a low risk exercise. It's relatively easy to recover from, and it's likely to give you a really good pump, which will likely increase your mind muscle connection with the next exercise, which is a low incline dumbbell bench press. We're going to be doing 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions in a superset with 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions of a dumbbell torso supported row on the same bench. So you literally just need to pick up 2 sets of dumbbells, one for each exercise. And then when you're done with the bench press, you flop onto your belly and you go for the row. After the first set of bench press, rest however long it takes for you to feel ready for the row. And after you've completed a set of each, I would suggest resting for between 1 and 3 minutes. 2 to 3 minutes is likely to be a sweet spot here, and you might want to go for closer to 3 minutes if you find yourself really cardiovascularly taxed by this superset. And as for the intensity of effort, I would set a range that goes from RPE 8, so leaving 2 repetitions in reserve, all the way to failure. And the way you would approach this range depends on the circumstances. I will go through the whole example first and then talk you through how I would approach progressing in proximity to failure. Once you've done these supersets, I would move on to a neutral grip lat pull down, 3 sets of 10 to 20 repetitions with 1 to 2 minutes rest. And again, I would aim for RPE 10 to failure. To finish off, we're going to have 3 sets of a cable lateral raise with a bias towards the lengthened position. I would complete 3 sets of 12 to 20 repetitions and a final drop set, including 1 set of 12 to 20 reps, followed by 3 drops. And I would take all of these exercises to failure because this is the only direct work you'll have for delts in this session. And again, it's a very low risk exercise that's easy to recover from. So why not make the most of it by going to failure? To wrap up, this is how I would approach a target range for your RPE as opposed to simply assigning yourself a specific RPE number like RPE 7 or 8 or 9. When you're at the beginning of the program, I would start on a lower RPE targets, and then I would progress in RPE targets as you go through the program. So in week 1, you might start on RPE 8, and then in week 2, you might progress to 9, and then 10, and then failure, and then you would carry on with failure until you decide it's time for a deload. This is just one example of how you could utilize an RPE target range. Another example is for people who have really demanding jobs, which take a lot out of them in terms of recovery, in which case you might want to choose your RPE target based on how fatigued you are on that particular day, whereby if it's a low fatigue day, you might take those sets to failure, but if it's a high fatigue day, you might want to err on the side of caution and leave a couple of extra reps in reserve. Finally, the way you approach these suggestions for number of sets and intensity of effort in particular, so volume and proximity to failure, differs, in my view, when you're in week 1 of a brand new program versus when you're just cruising through weeks of a well-known program. If it's a very new program, whether it's because you're new to the gym or you're just coming back to the gym after a deload or after a vacation, what I would do is to reduce the number of sets and lower the RPE target. So all of these exercises I've listed, I've programmed for 3 sets, except for the cable lateral raise where it was 3 sets plus a drop set. Now in week number 1 of this brand new program, I would probably do 2 sets of at least some of these, if not all of these. And for the drop set, instead of doing 1 set plus 3 drops, I would do 1 set plus 2 drops, so a total of 3 sets for that drop set. In addition to that, instead of aiming for failure or the higher end of your RPE target range, I would err on the side of staying closer to RPE 7 or 8 for most exercises. The exception being the isolation exercises like the tac fly and the cable lateral raise, which again are easy to recover from. They are low risk. So if you take these closer to failure, RPE 8, 9, 10, I don't think that's a big deal in week number 1. I would only be particularly conservative in that case if you were a true beginner, because when I train a beginner who's never really trained before, I really aim to prioritize form in a safe environment. So I would rather they train a little further away from failure while developing good form habits. I wouldn't necessarily want them to train like they're doing warm-up sets the whole workout, because 1, it's not very motivating for them, it's not very fun, but number 2, it is harder to maintain proper form if you're training with 3 to 4 repetitions in the tank, so RP 6 or 7, as opposed to if you were at RP 5 or less. And if you never learn to control your form when the sets are really challenging, then when you make them more challenging, you might find yourself having to relearn form in a way because of the increased challenge of the load. So I wouldn't want a brand new client to train to failure in their first workouts at the gym, but I would encourage them over time to get a little bit closer to failure than simply performing warm-up sets, because I don't believe that in the long term that benefits them as much as keeping the RPE conservative but still training close enough to failure that they can feel that it's getting harder to control the weight. And that's a wrap for the Muscle Masterclass series. I've had a blast recording these episodes. I've been wanting to create a resource like this for a really long time, but I wasn't sure about the best format. And I love podcasting. I think I've got relatively good at it in the last 3 years that I've been doing it. So hopefully you took as much out of it or more as I was hoping for. I would love to hear your feedback about it if you had the time to spare any. And as always, if you want to work with me, I'm taking on new online clients. So you can fill out the form in the show notes and we can jump on a call and see if we're a good fit. For now, thank you very much for listening and I will talk to you soon. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.